Thank you for your support of Regent Audio. Each recording in this series was produced by Regent Audio, which owns the copyright. No portion of these recordings may be reproduced for any reason without prior written consent from Regent Audio. For more resources, please visit www.regentaudio.com.
Well, welcome back in, folksies. I think we've got pretty much everybody. We had a question about Malcolm's books. Malcolm doesn't have any of his own books here. However, he does have a CD of him reading his book, or reading the sonnets in his book, Sounding the Seasons.
Sounding the Seasons. So that's, a CD. Actually recorded it here in Canada, funny enough. So it's all 70 sonnets of this poem, the Sounding the Seasons, which is a journey through the church year, from Advent through to the Feast of Christ the King. So those are all on one CD, and I just, because I'm traveling and going to various places, I just wasn't able to bring books, but the CDs were less bulky. So I've got those, and I sort of got them sort of reasonably from the people who made them. So I can just sell those CDs for $10 each, and all you'd need, I think if I just put them somewhere and then put a bowl beside them.
Okay.
And just put
That
the
sounds
$10
good.
in there.
We'll put you in touch with Laura, and so it's somewhere near where Bob's books are as well, and then all that stuff is in the same area.
I've got a bunch of those. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. And while I'm looking at Malcolm and thinking of various things like this, Bruce, right over your shoulder is the DVD there. Yeah. So this is not for sale, but just so you know, while I'm looking at Stephen here and Malcolm here, the same. Well, okay. So the same chap, your arm can take a break. Yeah, thanks. But that DVD will be sitting there if you want to take a look at it. Andrew Wall, Canadian film producer and director, who did a documentary on Malcolm and Steve Bell and won a bunch of awards for that. He's just won a bunch of awards for his work on Mennonite migration history for a new documentary he's just done on that. It's just come out. And he's actually won awards for that baby over there too. And the genesis of this documentary called The Fantasy Makers, Lewis, Tolkien, and George MacDonald, was a conversation with Malcolm when he was doing the filming. I don't know if you know this, when he was doing the filming of the Steve Bell, Malcolm Guite documentary, and he got really excited, interested in Lewis and Tolkien, and just thinking about Christian imagination, especially in the Christian culture he knew out west, how that wasn't explored, wasn't really allowed, wanted to delve deeper into that, started reading more intentionally Lewis and Tolkien, stumbled upon MacDonald independently during his reading, and said to himself, why the heck do I know about this guy MacDonald? He, of course, should be included. And so the documentary turned into the triumvirate, and he went to the States, Canada, the UK to film various people. And Steve's mug is on there, and Malcolm's and myself. And down in the library, I like to say that when they came to film, and I'm attempting to answer Andrew's questions, in the background, they all fell in love with Vigo, refused to let him leave the room. Vigo's sleeping behind the pink couch in the library. They assure me that's fine. Vigo almost never snores. I've heard him snore about 4 times ever, and he starts snoring so loudly. But like our wonderful sound engineer back here, they all said, don't worry, we can edit that out. But you can imagine, if you do watch it, you can think of Vigo snoring in the background.
These are the 2 stars, they really are. And it's a great film.
And you can get it on Amazon.
Yeah, it's on Amazon Prime.
Yeah, sorry, it's on Amazon Prime as well as you can watch it.
Yeah.
What's it called? Fantasy Makers, I think.
Yeah. And it's a great it's a great introduction to all 3 of those chaps, and how their faith informs their fantasy and their imagination, and really helps. They put a little crack into the reality that the contemporary fantasy literature's roots are in Christianity. A concept that will shock a lot of people today, but as most of you know, is true. Great, I think, if I can dare say this, I think it's a great tool for classroom, for teaching. I know several people who've used it in church groups, discussion groups, book groups. Yeah. Okay. I think that's all straggly details. We've got until 5 o'clock ish for this session. And before Malcolm delves into his lecture proper there, that all looks very official, I'm going to ask him to start off with just telling us, this is a little bit more of the Malcolm introduction, how, where, why did you first encounter C.S. Lewis?
Right. Well, I had sort of several different encounters with Lewis at different stages in my life, each of which, you know, could have been with a different... I mean, it would have been really satisfying if it had been 3 different people who gave me these distinct things, you know, the imagination and my childhood fantasy and Narnia, and then the fabulous literary criticism as a teenager trying to get why poetry was so good, and then you know, a profound theology, you know, and I would have been grateful to 3 people, each with distinctive skills, who'd done that for me, and the idea that they all turn out to be the same person was itself a kind of gift and a realization that there was something extraordinary going with this guy. So my first encounter, I suppose, like many people, was simply through Narnia. And I think my sister I've got an older sister, and she was starting to read the Narnia books. So in the usual way, I was getting her sort of cast-offs, you know. So I was quite young, I think, when I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I sort of read right through them in the end, and I absolutely loved them, and I just, you know, absorbed them. And funnily enough, you know, the snow in, I was reading them in Africa, and, you know, when we went back to England, it was always in the summer. So I didn't encounter snow until I came to Canada, you know. And so there's always something, ever since, been something sort of magical about snow. But anyway, so I read the Narnia books, and in fact was so entranced with those, and they entered sort of, so I reread them, and I loved the Pauline Baines illustrations. That was very much part of it for me. And so much so, and I think, you know, with a deep yearning that somehow they should be true, that somehow they just felt that. And so I described earlier on all this from my parents' point of view, you know, major political, personal, and financial crisis, which involved our being sent away to be shielded from violence, you know, to Cambridge. I kind of knew stuff was going on, but I really, you know, as a 9-year-old, I didn't really take any of it seriously. But when they said Cambridge, I went, aha, that is where the house is, which has the picture of the Dawn Treader, because you may remember Eustace Scrubb lives in Cambridge. So for me, the great excitement was that somehow I was going to a place that had some contact with Narnia. I didn't know that Lewis himself had been in Cambridge or anything like that. And then subsequently, when I was sent to school in England, and I realized I wanted to, you know, you make a choice quite early in the English school system about what you specialize in, and when you do what's called A-levels, which is the last 2 years of high school, you know, you're either arts or science, and I was arts, and I had very good English teachers, but we did Milton. We did both Comus and a couple of books of Paradise Lost. And the English teacher commended us to read C.S. Lewis's preface to Paradise Lost as a way into Milton. And it was just the most lucid and helpful piece of literary criticism I'd ever read. I think it still is. It was astonishingly good writing. And of course, quietly, he's giving you a really good grounding in theology. You know, the chapter on Augustine and how Milton uses Augustine's basic. So then I began to read a bit more of Lewis as a literary critic, and thought, gosh, you know, this person who gave me Narnia is also now opening up Eden's enormous bliss, you know, and the chapter on how Milton describes paradise and, as it were, pulls out the paradisal stop in us, plays us like an organ, you know, all that moved me. And the accounts of, then I realized, I began to read more widely in Lewis's criticism and realized what good things he had to say about Comus. And my sort of guilty pleasure in the reading side of life at that time was Shelley. Shelley was very much out of favor, you know, and you were supposed to be the romantics were all being dismissed as adolescent, and Shelley is the most adolescent of them all. And I realized that Lewis loved Shelley, and in his rehabilitations, he has a real defense of Shelley and a defense of Shelley against Eliot. So I began to realize that Lewis was a great guide, you know, and was really helping me in my literature. So I continued to read Lewis. Lewis's criticism was not in fashion at all. When I came up to Cambridge, I realized that, you know, there was already a quite strong secular turn. But Lewis's wonderful sort of Rubicon face still adorned the steps that led up into the English faculty library in Cambridge. So I kind of saw him beaming down on me and was encouraged and, you know, subtly brought Lewis. And I realized quite quickly if you wanted good marks in the essay, you could make a point you'd drawn from Lewis and people would say it was brilliant. But as soon as you said it was by Lewis, they'd put a red line through it, you know. So you had to be... But anyway, so I began to be encouraged by Lewis. And then, of course, when I began to make my own journey to faith and to be awakened by that, having by this time, you know, really begun to absorb a lot of medieval poetry and got my, and I'd chosen to do Anglo-Saxon. And again, Lewis's article on the Anglo-Saxon meters, which has the planets poem in it, is astonishing. So I already had the sense of Lewis as a guide. And then when I was coming to faith, I realized that that he had some great theology to offer. And in fact, the journey to faith, I mean, a lot of things were involved in it, but one of them was a feeling that there were, you know, that the Gospels here, you know, you kind of think you've read the Gospels, but you haven't really. And I was also getting very interested in Plato, and I in the summer that led to the sort of, you know, part of my both imaginative intellectual conversion, I had to get summer jobs all the time to kind of keep body and soul together. And I got a summer job in London in an ice cream factory, in Wall's ice cream factory. And I was one of the guys that, like, the ice creams would come down into this frozen warehouse and it would travel along on a thing and you stack them onto pallets. But there was a union rule that you couldn't be more than 20 minutes in the deep freeze, you know, because we had these big coats, and I had long hair in those days, and it would turn white, you know, completely. I mean, it wasn't white then, you know, but it would get frosted and you'd come out. So there was this sort of mizzen hut where the workers who were packing the ice creams sort of thawed for 20 minutes and then went back down. And there was no lunch break or any other breaks, but you had your 20 minutes on, 20 minutes off. So I hit on this idea that I could read my way through the prime texts I wanted to read, which was the dialogues of Plato, the four Gospels. And I decided, I don't know, it's just some instinct in my mind, I hadn't articulated it, that I ought to just enjoy Narnia again. So, of course, when you're reading the dialogues of Plato and the Gospels on Narnia, you go, wait a minute.
And how old are you?
It's all in Plato. So this was the summer of 79. So I was 21. So, and it actually was a great way of reading, because 20 minutes, you know, they're all pretty big, intense texts. 20 minutes reading, and then 20 minutes mindlessly stacking ice creams while you think about it. Then you come up out of the deep freeze again. And so it was fantastic, you know. Plus, of course, you really appreciate that this is no thaw, it's spring. You know? Yes. So I kind of had this thing, and later on when some years later, I read Surprised by Joy. And that lovely bit in Surprised by Joy where Lewis says, I suppose in a way my imagination was baptized before I was, and the rest of me just took a little bit longer to catch up, you know, and that very much, you know, was my story. So Lewis was taking part in this kind of all the way through. But in fact, he had one more surprise for me, which was a wonderful, you know, thank you, sort of personal gift, very personal gift from Lewis. So after I became a Christian in my final year, and I was confirmed in February of 1980, and then I went off, and I had a year hanging about doing nothing in particular, and then I went and trained as a teacher. Came back down to Cambridge in 82, 83, and met Maggie, the woman who's to become my wife, and fell in love with her. And so I got to know her and her family, and there came the point that, you know, when you're the woman you've decided you really want to actually marry, takes you to meet her family. And she was just, in terms of the gentle gradations of English society, she was kind of, in English social life, sort of, I felt her to be a little bit sort of above there and out of my reach, and I felt a bit like sort of Pip, you know, visiting Estella with his clod-hopping boots, you know. And it was quite an old-fashioned household, and in Richmond, in Surrey, and her father was a very sort of distinguished lawyer, and her grandfather had been a baronet and, you know, honoured for his work in medicine. And it was very formal. We met there, and, you know, immediately the women disappeared into some parlour, and I was invited by her father into the drawing room and given a glass of sherry, and we stood around, you know, and I thought, oh, golly, how am I even, I'm going to have... Anyway, so we're talking about this and that. And I don't know why, it just happened to come up. I happened to, maybe it was a hot day, and we were talking about how, lovely it is in a hot day if, there's brooks and streams. And I said, I love the invocation of the water in Comus, Sabrina fair, listen where thou art sitting under the glassy green translucent wave. And he immediately picked it up. His eyes lit up and he said, under the glassy green translucent wave, in twisted braids of lilies knitting the loose train of thy amber dropping hair. I thought, yes, So he said, then we started quoting bits of Milton to each other. And he said, we seem to have very similar literary tastes. So I said, well, yes, I think, we do. I mean, I said, for what it's worth, I think my whole way into Milton, but my literary taste more generally, my great guide, to the treasure house of literature has been C.S. Lewis. And he said, yeah, it's exactly the same for me. In fact, I can remember when he said to me, you've got to read Milton aloud to read him at all. And I said, what? And so it turns out he had been one of Lewis's students at Magdalen in Oxford in the 30s, in the absolute prime. And in fact, he got a first in English, and very much under Lewis's tutelage. And then he'd gone off and become a lawyer. And he actually hadn't had anybody to talk about literature to for ages, So we were getting on, suddenly I was completely relaxed, and it was great, and we talked about things, and he told me some great C.S. Lewis stories, and including that when Maggie, my wife, as a little girl, started to read Narnia and absolutely loved it, he noticed the name and said, oh, that's my old tutor, So he realised Lewis was at Magdalen in Cambridge by then, and he wrote to him and said, I'm sure you don't remember me, but, I just want to tell you that my little girl is reading your children's stories and so much enjoying them. And he got a lovely letter back from Lewis saying, yes, I remember you, and I remember you got a first, and all this. And, if I realise you travel, if you're ever in Cambridge, do come and arrange to have dinner with me, and if you want to bring your little girl's books, I'd be happy to sign them. And it was all set up, but by this time, this was the early 60s, and Lewis was, beginning to become ill, and he was ill when the thing, and then he died before this thing ever happened. Though later, when we were going through my father-in-law's stuff after he died, we found some wonderful things, including a lovely handwritten note from Lewis to him when he'd asked Lewis about what marks he'd got. And in Oxford, that nobody tells you your marks, if you're individual papers or anything like that, you just get a first or a 2-1 or whatever it is. But so he'd written to Lewis, and Lewis wrote this lovely note back saying, I'm afraid your marks are among the arcana imperii of the English faculty, but I can tell you did well on such and such a paper. Anyway, so we got on very well. And there came a point where Maggie and I were serious enough with each other, and I'd asked her if she'd married me, and she said yes. But I realised such was the nature of that household that I really would formally have to ask her father for her hand in marriage. And I was still... So we got to this point where we're having this really great conversation about Shelley and, how right Lewis was to praise Shelley over against it. And I said, oh, by the way, sir, I was wondering if I might have your daughter's hand in marriage. And he said... Yes, of course. Now, the thing about the Ode to the West Wind is the Dante illusion. That's what Lewis showed. We carried on. So I thought, thank you, Jack. So it's sort of, yeah. But it's lovely. I mean, there are in Cambridge, one way or another, all kinds of just little living connections with Lewis, I got to know, towards the end of her life, I got to know Barbara Reynolds, and again, she, both with Dorothy Sayers and with Lewis, had all kinds of connections, so yeah.
That's wonderful. Okay, we could carry on, as I know, all afternoon doing that, but let's take you here first, and we'll get more of this later. So over to you, Malcolm. Thank you.
Okay, right. So, we talked about the poetic imagination in general, through Shakespeare. But in the next couple of talks, I want to really take some of that and think about how the poetic imagination is at work in Lewis and Tolkien. And, to make the case clearly that it is a truth-bearing faculty, and that it is bodying forth the form of things unknown, but not airy nothings. I want to really begin by drawing out what sort of imagination itself kind of meant to Lewis. So I'll start by just telling you a story. As we came up towards 2013 and the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death, I had the good, I thought it was good fortune at the time. It turned out to be incredibly hard work. But the then editor of the journal Theology wrote to me and asked if I'd like to be a sort of guest editor of a sort of special Lewis edition of Theology that would come out in that November of 2013. And I I shouldn't really edit anything because I'm not very good at that kind of thing, but I couldn't resist the temptation because it meant I could sort of call on anybody, more or less, in the theological world and say, write me something, about Lewis. So I was obviously going to get Rowan Williams to do something, which he did. And I wanted to, I was going to write something myself. But anyway, I got in touch also with Professor Alistair McGrath, and we thought we'd do a thing where he, as a sort of joint thing almost, that he would write a paper on Lewis's appeal to reason in his apologetics. And I would write a thing on Lewis's appeal to the imagination. And of course, as we began to work on our papers, we were kind of corresponding. We kept on calling each other up and saying, do you mind if I trespass on your territory? Because, of course, as soon as Alistair McGrath began to look at the range of the way in which Lewis addresses his arguments and if you would think of straightforward apologetic works like Mere Christianity or The Problem of Pain or Miracles, he realized that every time Lewis is making a point, even when he's slightly overdoing it and making a kind of knockdown argument, he appeals to the imagination. He's constantly bodying forth theological ideas in all kinds of extraordinary and apt and often very everyday metaphors. So the appeal to the imagination is kind of enfolded into the use of reason. Meantime, I was realizing that Lewis's own conversion and the integration between his reason and his imagination, which occurred really in his coming to Christ, became part of his rational apologetic. That the very fact that your imagination yearned after and you had that inconsolable secret of longing, and that you could begin to shape in your mind something you'd never seen, but the argument that in some sense the divine discontent, the desire for it, means that there's at least a possibility that it's there. Famously he says, if you're thirsty in a desert, you may not get water, you may perish without it. But it's not unreasonable to suppose that you live in a cosmos in which the quenching of thirst is possible. That you're a creature designed for the water. And that when we have longings, which nothing in the world at all can fully satisfy, and we have to keep imagining the shapes of what these things might be. That may partly be part of a genuinely rational argument of why we might. So imagination and reason, in fact, are completely mutually enfolded in Lewis's account of Christianity. And, of course, famously in the bizarrely titled essay, Blue Spells and Flallan Spheres, which is one of Lewis's most important essays, but he gave it such a naff and difficult to pronounce title that nobody ever... But famously, towards the end of that, he brings reason and imagination together in a single sentence and says, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. And that you can have a truth, but you need a meaning, and that these things are mutually enfolded. So we discovered in the course of this, and eventually Alistair McGrath and I kind of did a dry run, viva voce, for what we wanted to say, at the Lewis festivities when they finally, at Westminster Abbey, unveiled a proper stone for him in Poets' Corner. And we spoke sort of after one another doing that. So I preface everything I want to say about Lewis and the poetic imagination by saying I don't want to set up a quarrel between reason and imagination in Lewis. Some people have done that. Some people have said, and Lewis recognized that he went over the top in some of his knockdown arguments, and there's a famous account that supposedly when he was doing the Socratic Club and Elizabeth Anscombe, resisted him and he felt absolutely deflated. I mean, I think the jury's out on that, actually. If you read a lot of the contemporary letters, I don't think he was as devastated as he thought he was. But some people have felt that he's moved more towards giving an imaginative account of the faith, and obviously writing the Narnia books and so on kind of later in his life, and that this was a response to the problematics of some of his arguments. I think there are problems. I mean, I think there are philosophical problems with some of his arguments in The Problem of Pain and elsewhere. And I think it was more, Lewis became aware that there was a certain mannerism actually in the way there was a certain arguing for victory and tub thumping in some of his purely apologetics works, which have caused difficulties for problems, and I think are difficult. And Lewis himself was very humorous about it. There's a wonderful, I think it's one of his letters somewhere, where he refers to, in a nice little pun, he refers to my bow wow dogmatism, which is just superb, And certainly the imagination was another way of coming at things. And if imagination apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends, then I think we can tend to Lewis in some ways more and more in our culture, that it's what he allows us to apprehend through his imaginative writing more than what he tries to kind of bludgeon us into comprehending with his rhetorical arguments broadly. But I still think that that Lewis's arguments are worth attending to as well. So that's one thing. Just before I go on to say what I want to say, just to add something about A Midsummer Night's Dream. There is a way of reading Midsummer Night's Dream in which you can sort of pretty consistently say, but particularly in the dialogue I showed you, that Theseus is speaking on behalf of reason, and that Hippolyta is speaking on behalf of imagination. And they are apparently quarreling in the beginning of Act 5. But the point is that by the end of the act, they're married. And the whole thing is a celebration of the conjunction of opposites and the complementary of opposites. And it's as if we can think of them as reason and imagination, then the play is a celebration of the marriage of reason and imagination, rather than the quarrel of reason and imagination. And in that case, we can say that Shakespeare arranged the marriage presciently about 50 years before English culture decided to go for a divorce between reason and imagination and to split. I mean, Shakespeare always gives his greatest wisdom to his fools. And you remember Touchstone the Fool in As You Like It, which again is a comedy, so everybody's getting married at the end. And when they're all being paired off, except there's Touchstone's there and there's Audrey the shepherdess. So Touchstone decides to chat Audrey up and decides it would be good to be a poet at this point. So he describes himself as a poet, and she knows perfectly well that he's winding her up. So she says, "Oh, I do not know what poetical is. Is it honest in deed and word?" Meaning, are your intentions to me honourable as you make this pass? And he takes her up on that and he says, "Nay, madam, verily, for our truest poetry is our most feigning," which is marvellous. He's actually saying, it's a joke in the play, but at a serious level, I think Shakespeare is saying, give me a chance to tell you a story and I'll tell you the truth. Give me a chance to make something up, that in the very act of feigning, I can give you a truth that you wouldn't come at otherwise. Now, not long after that, you're getting, into the 17th century, and you're getting the sort of foundation of the Royal Society late in the 17th century, and you're getting this whole idea of an absolute split between the exact and mathematical language that's needed for science and what Thomas Spratt, who wrote an account of the Royal Society, which was really its kind of manifesto almost, where he said, we must forever eschew the delightful deceits of fables, and the false colours of rhetoric. And we must always prefer a speech that is as near as possible to the plain and the mathematical, i.e., we're not going to come at truth unless we eliminate the imagination. And that split grew deeper and deeper and wider and became the whole split between the so-called subjective and the so-called objective, a split that Coleridge in various ways tried to heal. But that's certainly the split that people of Lewis's and Tolkien's generation inherited. That yes, there was a place for imagination, but there was a kind of, if I can put it this way, there was a kind of epistemological apartheid had been arrived at by the end of the 19th century, whereby you had a split between actually genuinely the case, purely true, objective, factual knowledge, which was empirical and testable and empirically to be discerned and was concerned with what could be weighed and measured, and whose best descriptive language was mathematical. And that was given the accolade of objective. And then there was the entire realm. I mean, that was all to do with quantity. There was no quality, there was no values in that. That was just, and then the entire realm of value and affect and meaning, in a sense, was carried over into the subjective. And subjective, of course, you could, in your subjective writing and your subjective feelings, you have as much imagination as you like, but it doesn't have any bearing on what is the case. It's not a lens or an instrument to show you what is the case. It's a separate thing. And they're almost like little Bantu stands, the separate development of the, and you can retreat into your little imaginative realm, to compensate yourself for the terrible, empty, cold, sheer, impersonal grittiness of things as they are. But the two things never meet, and they can't make truth claims over against one another. And that's the world that Lewis inherited, and he famously wrote about it when he's describing himself as a young philosophy don, because Lewis, like so many of his generation, he came up and then his education was interrupted by the Great War, and he went out to the Western Front and was wounded, and was a young officer on the Western Front like Tolkien. And he comes back, and he has a triple first in Oxford. So he gets a first in classics, and then he says, well, I haven't got a job yet, so I might as well do philosophy, it's philosophy. And then he does English, and he's got firsts in all three. But the first actual job he manages to get is as a philosophy don. And so contemporary philosophy is not doing him any favors. Meantime, he's secretly reading the Norse sagas and, Balder the Beautiful and all these things, and Shelley. But he's teaching a very reductive kind of philosophy, and this is what he says, and I think this is the first quotation on the sheet I've given you. He's looking back from some distance and surprised by joy. The two hemispheres of my mind were in the sharpest contrast. On the one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth, and on the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved, I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. Does that ring any bells? I mean, it seems to me Lewis is not simply describing the two hemispheres of his own mind. It seems to me he's describing a radical rift right in the middle of Western culture as it was developing in the scientific age. He's the kind of canary in the cage, really, singing out, saying, this is bad, we can't live with this. This is a divide that is going to kill us all. So that's where he is. Now, we might say, of course, this account of his dilemma was written post-conversion and many years after the period he's describing. However, there is a much more contemporary document. And when I was working, I was asked to write the chapter on Lewis as a poet for the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis, which was edited by Michael Ward and McSwain. Yeah, Thomas McSwain. So this was great. It was a real breakthrough because this was secular Cambridge CUP. And there have been various proposals to have a Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis, which had all been rejected because they just assumed that this was going to be a sort of shop front for conservative American evangelicals, using Lewis as a big stick to beat everybody else with. And, CUP was not going to have anything to do with that. Whereas the great, Ward was a really serious scholar and, the book was going to contain a lot about Lewis's criticism and so on. So it was pucker. Of course, it wasn't an entirely Christian project, but I wrote the chapter on Lewis as a poet. I'd read some of Lewis's poetry, but I hadn't. So I spent, quite a long time. I mean, completely absorbing myself in Lewis's poetry, and really felt that he was a very considerable poet, and a more considerable poet than he himself or other people had given him credit for. But I became more and more drawn to this extraordinary poem, which in Walter Hooper's hastily produced, rapidly edited collection of C.S. Lewis's poems, which came out in '64, poems of C.S. Lewis. So you think Lewis died in '63. I mean, and I'm immensely grateful to Walter Hooper for producing this, but he did kind of bundle them all together and get them out there. And unfortunately, he chose to open that anthology with, I mean, it's with a little squib of Lewis's where he's having a go at Eliot. And he's saying, oh, I can't be much of a poet because the evening doesn't look like patient etherized on a table to me. You think, oh, do you know what I mean? And like somebody opening it, it's not an invitation to take Lewis seriously. And in fact, it misses out on the fact that Lewis actually had serious engagements with Eliot later. So there are problems with that anthology, but at least it's there and we got the poems. And there's a poem in there entitled Reason with big capital letters, which I've given you here, and which it seemed to me from internal evidence must have been written pretty closely on the cusp of or just before Lewis's conversion, and is in fact, in a way, a much more reliable thing than the bit about the two hemispheres of my mind from Surprised by Joy, because that's written post hoc, you know, many years later, whereas this is a report from the front line of that split. But the more I read this poem, the more I thought it couldn't possibly have been called Reason. I just thought, because it's about reason and imagination, it's about the whole problem. And it's about who, if possible, is there a reconciler? Can there be a reconciler? Who will reconcile in me? And I would have called this poem Who, if I'd been titling it. But, you know, certainly you would have had, if you weren't going to call it Who, you'd have to toss a coin between whether you called it reason or whether you called it imagination. So eventually, I was so dissatisfied with this, I actually had the opportunity to talk to Walter Hooper. So I asked him, I said, look, in the monograph, you know, in the actual, is that what Lewis called it? And he kind of looked back and he said, oh, no, Lewis didn't give a title to it at all. So I said, well, why did you call it Reason? And he said, well, it seems to start off being all about reason. You know, I was working rapidly. I thought, you know, that's fine. And I thought it might be associated with the time of Pilgrim's Regress, and, you know, that these big, reason is a character in Pilgrim's Regress. So that's why I went for it. I was so relieved to discover that it wasn't called that. I subsequently had conversations with Alistair McGrath about this, and I thought this poem might be, I don't know, as late as 28 or 29. Alistair McGrath thinks it maybe is 26. And if that's the case, then Lewis lived in the dilemma described in this poem for, what, 6 years? 5 or 6 years before he got the answer to his question, which is amazing. So let's look at the poem. I've given it as Reason there, because that's. I'm very happy now that Don King, as you probably know, has produced a much better, fuller, critical edition of Lewis's poetry, and partly because I'd written about this when I wrote the thing in the Cambridge Companion. He took that into view and he removed the title Reason from the poem and discussed why he did that in the introduction. But titles make a big difference to how you read the poem, and I think if you thought this poem was called Reason, you might have a slightly skewed reading of it. So let's just hear the poem. Interestingly, since we're talking about the quarrel, apparently, between reason and imagination, this poem is set in Athens. Well, it's set in the soul of C.S. Lewis, but with Athens, as it were, as the great metaphor, the figuring of that. Whether there's any kind of half memories of Midsummer Night's Dream, I don't know, but certainly Shakespeare is trying to look at the relationship between reason and imagination and chooses Athens as well. So this is an account of Lewis's state of mind or soul, figured through ancient Athens and two goddesses. And I expect you're familiar with it. Let me read it, because it is just a great poem. Set on the soul's acropolis, the reason stands, a virgin armed, commercing with celestial light. And he who sins against her has defiled his own virginity. No cleansing makes his garment white. So clear is reason. But how dark imagining. Warm, dark, obscure and infinite, daughter of night. Dark is her brow, the beauty of her eyes with sleep is loaded, and her pains are long, and her delight. Tempt not Athene, wound not in her fertile pains Demeter, nor rebel against her mother right. Oh, who will reconcile in me both maid and mother, who make in me a concord of the depth and height, who make imagination's dim exploring touch ever report the same as intellectual sight? Then could I truly say and not deceive, then wholly say that I believe. It's a very, very remarkable poem. Shows, of course, his knowledge of the range of things in Athens and the Greek world. I mean, we think of the Greeks as, we think of Euclid in geometry, and we think of, Plato and Aristotle and a real establishment of philosophy. But of course, the Greek mystery religions are another thing altogether, and the Eleusinian mysteries and all, And of course, there was a great book which Lewis would have known, Kitto's, which is still a great book to read, Kitto's The Greeks and the Irrational, looking at what they're doing with the tragedies and the whole notions of sort of purgation and so on. But so it's a remarkable poem. First of all, there's a wonderful sense of the inner space, the range of the psyche itself, of our souls, the depth and height. And then there's the bodying forth. This is a real example of imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, or the form of things. He takes these two great powers and forms of knowing, forms of episteme, forms of ways of knowing, reason and imagination, and he bodies them forth in the form of two goddesses, Athene, the goddess of wisdom, of course, and Demeter, who is a goddess of fertility and growth and the corn. And this is no glib classical illusion, in the 18th century manner. It's a symbolic reimagination of your inner self, in which two great powers in your soul, which are personal, but perhaps more than personal, more than human, are at work. And it's really significant just to observe that at this point in Lewis, this is Lewis in the mid to late 1920s, the Lewis that people want to kind of, certainly contemporary literary historians tend to sort of have a very caricaturish picture of Lewis, don't they, as this sort of tweedy, clubbable, pipe-smoking Don who, hung around with an exclusively male club of Inklings and probably couldn't, relate very well to women. And then if they know anything about him or his life or Mrs. Moore, they immediately go into full Freudian mode and say, this is some bizarre relationship with a mother, etc. And they kind of want to look back at him as exactly the kind of trouble, gender-bound, masculinist, whatever, right? But when you actually read the poetry that the man is writing, he figures the two deepest things that he's trying to reconcile in his own soul, both as feminine. I mean, you could actually sum up this poem by this tweed-covered Don as saying, basically, my problem is I can't get my inner goddesses together. And he's really saying that. I've got to think, reason is feminine, imagination is feminine. Athene, she's up on the soul's Acropolis. She's commercing with celestial light. So she represents the absolute undeniable clarity of the clearly demonstrated theorem, right? You see it. The stars, you see them in their beauty. Their patterns and orders are unchangeable. We're not here in the mist and the dark and everything. So that's sight and clarity. And that's reason. And the Acropolis is a great temple at the pinnacle of Athens. And when Lewis says, set on a virgin arm, he who sins against her has defiled his own virginity. No cleansing makes his garment white, so clear as reason. What is he saying? He's saying, if something is true and demonstrably true, and you have seen and assented at some point in your life to the demonstration of that truth, then never deny it, however inconvenient the truth is. You cannot make stuff up. You cannot fudge the facts. You can't, you know, if you've had a clear demonstration, you know, that the Earth is a great deal older than 6,000 years, but you happen to have had previously a favourite interpretation of the Bible by Ussher in which he'd added up the numbers and thought it was 6,000 years old, I'm afraid you're going to have to ditch your favourite interpretation because you've got to face the facts. And, you know, if you know that 2 and 2 is 4, but it's politically convenient to you that it should be 5 or 3.5, if you once consent, even half-knowingly, to the falsehood, no cleansing makes your garment white. You'll never be sure of another fact again. You will never be sure of another fact again. You will not be able to have the truth. Dante explores this very profoundly in Inferno, and he looks at certain people who've fraudulently changed facts and statistics, and he says that they have lost il ben d'intelletto, the good of the intellect. You lose that, you're finished, you know. And that's true politically, and it's true experimentally. And, you know, anybody, you know, in the scientific world that fudges the facts or fakes the evidence, that's it. No cleansing makes his garment white. And if Lewis is going to assent to anything, and if he's going to assent and say, I believe, then he needs at least grounds for saying that this faith does not offend reason, right? It may not be demonstrable by reason, but it must be consistent with reason. It's a faith which must be capable of using reason to seek understanding. And it must at least give me a way of looking at the cosmos in which the cosmos makes at least as much, if not more, sense than whatever the current secular model is. But if within the secular model certain things have been demonstrated and really are the case, then they really are the case. And I can't, you know, take self-contradictions and gloss them over as paradoxes if they're not actually paradoxes, they're just clean flaws in logic. So Lewis is, from then and all the way through his life, is not willing to comfort himself by pretending to believe as fact something that some part of his reason knows is actually not the case. Would that was so, you know, some of the other people that make apologetics for the Christian. So clear is reason. And then he looks at this whole other thing. But how dark, imagining. Warm, dark, obscure, and infinite, daughter of night, dark is her brow. The beauty of her eyes with sleep. This is a beautiful account of the imagination and the way the imagination works through sleep and dreams, and how actually her pains are long and her delight. Pains there is both the sense that it is with our affect and our imagination that we experience terror and loss and sorrow, as well as joy and delight. But also, pains here are surely labour pains. You know, not there, and they're also the pains of the poet and the pains of the artist. They're taking pains over things, but they're also the pains through which things come to birth. Her pains are long, and her delight. Tempt not Athene, but tempt not Athene is where he'd been living. He's saying, I wish I believed all this other stuff. My many-islanded sea of poetry and myth, you know. Nearly all I thought to be true, I thought grim and meaningless. Nearly all I loved, I thought to be imaginary. Because he was being honest to Athene, and at that point he thought that Athene was the only goddess in town. That, you know, he bought into the post-Enlightenment view that only the reason and scientific demonstration gives you access to verifiable truth, and the rest is just a bunch of temporary subjective stuff we're making up. He bought into that. So therefore he had to say what Athene seemed to be telling him, and what Athene seemed to be telling us, you know, in the 1920s, was that we are an accidental epiphenomenon thrown up by the chance concatenation of random atoms in an otherwise meaningless cosmos. And that there's a series of that which fame made informed us is blind. That the process of natural selection is certainly blind. It's not got a plan. It's, you know, it's simply what happened to be fittest to survive at that point. And that therefore any sense we have of divine shaping or purpose or anything like that is illusory. And that's a line of thinking which has been taken and developed even more so by the Richard Dawkinsons and so on of this world, you know, the selfish gene, etc. And yet we're haunted by this other stuff. But in this poem, Lewis realizes that Demeter is a goddess too. Tempt not Athene, wound not in her fertile pains Demeter, nor rebel against her mother right. He realizes that all this time, imagination has also been an organ of meaning, has been a faculty, that this is a power of the soul, also in touch with ultimate reality, but coming at that reality in a completely different way, in a way which gives different messages and uses different senses. So Athene has her sense is sight, but Demeter's sense is touch. It's almost an echo of they might feel after and find. So tempt not Athene, wound not in her fertile pains Demeter, nor rebel against her mother right. Then the great cry of agony, oh, who will reconcile in me both maid and mother, who make in me a concord of the depth, Demeter, and height, Athene, who make imagination's dim exploring touch ever report the same as intellectual sight. Then could I truly say and not deceive, then wholly say that I believe. And of course, by the time we've read this poem a few times, you know, we're like the children in the pantomime, you know, who want to say, he's behind you. You know, you can see that, like all good questions, this question is carrying its answer on its back. It's shaping up to something. In fact, it's so shaping up to it that consciously or unconsciously, I assume at this point unconsciously, Lewis is actually echoing the language of Scripture. He's echoing Ephesians, is he not? The great prayer that ye, being rooted and grounded in love, may have power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and know the love of God, Christ, the love of Christ, which passeth knowledge. This is the whole point about what kind of knowledge. It's a whole prayer about the way you know and about the possibility of reconciling height and depth, and Christ is that reconciler. But who will reconcile in me both maid and mother, who make in me a concord of the depth and height? So Christ's ministry is reconciliation, our ministry is reconciliation. This whole question of the depth and height, earth and heaven, the things contrary. Christ is precisely the one who reconciles the depth and the height, who brings imagination and reason together. And in fact, who will reconcile in me both maid and mother? You think, come on, Jack. Who is the person who comes into the world through somebody who is both a maid and a mother? You know, Mary herself is a reconciliation of these things. So, you know, but being a bear of little, very little range, so he staggers on, you know, and eventually, as we all know, there comes that extraordinary. I mean, he's converted intellectually from a kind of atheism into a kind of deism, and then from deism into a kind of highly intellectualized quasi-Platonic theism. But this is still a set of very kind of intellectual exercises, really. Jesus hasn't fitted into this. And then, of course, comes the famous walk with Tolkien and Dyson, the people with whom he's loved his many-islanded sea of myth and poetry, the famous walk in Addison's Walk in that September of 1931? Is it 31 or 30? Oh, matters not. But they've been talking away about what they love about myth and poetry and everything, and Lewis famously says, oh, I love these myths, but they're only lies, even though they're lies breathed through silver. And Tolkien famously says, they're not lies. And Tolkien begins to make the account, which he then sets out in the poem Mythopoeia, which he then sends subsequently as a result of this conversation to Lewis, begins to make the account for how the shaping imagination actually bodies forth all kinds of truths through mythology, and that this is a primary way of talking and speaking of truth. And Lewis says, well, you know, the trouble is, you know, it's still myth. It didn't actually happen. So it's still in the realm of thing. And then at another point in the conversation, Lewis is going on about Jesus, and he says, I can't see the point of the whole story, you know, because, okay, grant that it might have happened historically, but how is it? It doesn't move me, you know. How is it that the death and the actual resurrection of one bloke, you know, 2,000 years ago, you know, what difference does that make to me? You know, bully for Jesus. And Tolkien or Dyson says, Jack, how is it that you respond with tears in your eyes to the story of the death of Balder, you know, and Hodder throws the spear and I heard a voice cry, Balder the beautiful is dead, and you wonder what it is that Odin, who hung 9 days on the world tree and descended into hell, what did he whisper? You know, Venus and Adonis, you just, every death and resurrection moves you to tears. And you say, oh yeah, but I can respond to that imaginatively because that's myth, you know. But this is just a historical fact and the story of Jesus. So then Tolkien, you know, finally says, can you not see that all those myths you love were whispering about something that would be reliably the case, that they were waiting to come true, and that in Jesus Christ they did come true. Myth is made history. Here is something which your imagination's dim exploring touch, your ability to apprehend, your sense of the endless newness and resonance and kind of reenacting and participation that myth makes you happen, that becomes your story and you become part of the myth. All of that stuff that you love in Balder, but can't trust because, you know, there was no Balder and, you know, and there was no Hodder and there was no Loki. And so, you know, it's great, but I can't touch it. It's not actually the case. Nearly all that I loved, I believe to be imaginary in the sense that not actually there. Can't you see that all of that has now become reliably and factually the case, and your reason has access to it, and you think about it, and you can read the New Testament, and you can look at the records, and you can say, under Pontius Pilate, and when Quirinius was governor of Syria, you know, that this is historical fact, and yet it doesn't cease at that moment to be resonant myth, because the poet who's telling you the story, we poets have to use words, but the poet who's telling you the story is using facts and history to convey the mythical truth. And it's real. And you, as they're walking around Addison's Walk, you can see the two hemispheres of Lewis's brain kind of quivering and coming satisfactorily together with Christ at the center. Christ is the one in whom these two kinds of epistemology, these two ways of knowing, come together. The apprehended and the comprehended, the heavenly and the earthly, the imagined and the rationally known, all become, you know, the mythopoeic and the absolutely objective, empirical, historical, physical, all come together in Christ, and both sides of his mind are satisfied. And there's a tremendous, you know, as you see it, as Lewis goes on from this and after his conversion, there's a kind of, it's almost like nuclear fusion, you know. There's such a release of creative energy in Lewis when these things come together, because these things that have been held apart. And every single one of the things that he asks in this question, who is going to do this for me, actually happen. And just to say something, you know, this might seem an odd thing to say, but I think I sometimes find it difficult when people ask me, you know, when I came to know Jesus as my personal savior, and that's all they want to know. They just want to know that there was a day when, you know, Jesus became my personal savior, as though the only thing Jesus had to do in life was to sort out a few of my personal emotional dilemmas, you know, and be personal to me. I mean, Lewis, on this account, and I think this is the true account, but you can contend that with me, but on this account that I'm giving you at least, Christ comes mightily and magnificently into C.S. Lewis's life as the solution to a problem in epistemology. And that is actually a bigger thing, you know, than just the, you know, Lewis has experiences a fundamental split between two ways of knowing, epistemology, episteme, to know. So, and Christ is it's like discovering, you know, a particle in particle physics. It's like finding a missing link. It's you know, two sets of knowledge, neither of which could be satisfactory, each of which seem to cancel and contradict the other. Suddenly you find the missing piece and they make sense. Later on in his great essay, The Grand Miracle, he talks about how if there was a literary work which everybody thought was great, but was deeply puzzling and was never quite satisfying and yet clearly had huge potential, if somebody came along and said, look, there's a missing chapter, I have discovered the missing chapter. And as soon as you put this missing chapter into the right place, the whole work makes sense, coheres, and becomes even more magnificent. you'd be very excited if that was the case. And you would want to check, when you put the missing chapter in, you want to make sure it wasn't just a pastiche manufactured by somebody else. The missing chapter would have to make as much sense of the chapters before it as of the chapters after it. And there'd have to be all kinds of little things that you were puzzled about that suddenly cohered and made sense. And Lewis goes on in that essay to say that the birth, death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is the missing chapter in the cosmos. And it suddenly makes sense of everything, of the fact that every day ends in night and begins again in day, and winter comes to spring, and seeds have to fall into the ground before they blossom. There's all, that the pattern of death and resurrection is itself the pattern of the cosmos, and there's also the pattern of the human psyche and the pattern of imaginative life and everything, so it's the missing chapter. So you get this sense that, first of all, Christ comes to Lewis as solving an epistemological problem, and you get personal salvation thrown in. But if you're a serious philosopher, you want your epistemology sorted out as well. And the point is, that's a great gift to everybody. I can talk about this idea of incarnation and of the divine having a single point of contact with the cosmos, which then transforms the way you see the whole cosmos and makes it sacramental. That's an appealing thing, as the early church discovered. It's an appealing thing to philosophers even before they've got around to confessing their sins and seeing their sins nailed on the cross, which of course they also need to do. But Jesus is, bigger than that. So the story. Lewis comes to faith and begins a great series of works, all of which are in one way or another concerned with the way reason and imagination, having been reconciled in Christ, can be enfolded together. Now, the fact that he could write this poem, which so clearly says that the poem is aching for Christ. It tells you about Christ. It actually uses the language of Ephesians about Christ. It uses maid and mother. And yet Lewis could write this and not know what he'd written for another 5 years. That's very remarkable thing, and it attests precisely an example of the way imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown. And I've given you a little passage from Coleridge's Biographia Literaria here, in which he talks about what he calls the philosophic imagination. And he calls it the sacred power of self-intuition. And it seems to me this poem of Lewis's, and the gap between writing it and getting the answer to it, is precisely an example of a working example of the sacred power. So here's what Coleridge says. They and only they can acquire the philosophic imagination, the sacred power of self-intuition, who within themselves can interpret and understand the symbol that the wings of the air sylph are forming within the skin of the caterpillar. Only those who feel in their own spirits the same instinct which impels the chrysalis of the horned fly to leave room in its involucrum for antennae yet to come. They know and feel that the potential works in them, even as the actual works on them. It's a wonderful analogy that Coleridge uses here. I just want to focus particularly on this thing about the chrysalis of the horned fly, leaving room in its involucrum for antennae yet to come, as an account of what the imagination is and how it works, particularly the poetic imagination. So if you think about it, here's this squidgy little thing, which is going to metamorphose into this instinct, which is going to have these beautiful antennae, right? And the antennae are the means of certain knowledge for the thing. They're the instruments of knowing for the insect, aren't they? They're going to go out. But it hasn't got them yet. And it's not going to get them unless they're protected, unless the space into which the antennae are going to grow has to be, the shape of the antennae has to be anticipated before they go. And this involucrum, this carapace is made to hold open and ready the shape into which the knowing will grow. Yeah? Now, Coleridge says that's what the poetic imagination is for. That's what all the arts are for, is that we are, the poets and the artists and the musicians and the myth makers and the mythopoeics are holding open for us a shape into which we have still to grow. They're gesturing towards the space that will be filled with knowledge. And they're giving us some idea of what it is. And gradually, the antennae grow into it. And that's exactly what happened with Lewis. Lewis's poem holds open a shape into which eventually the antennae of Lewis's intellect grow. Or the other image he says is that the wings of the air self are forming within the chrysalis. So that seems to me not only what Lewis's poem was doing for him, but if we take that seriously, and if we think now about the Inklings, just think about the Inklings as great mythopoeic writers of the last century, making and shaping with the poetic imagination at its deepest, of the kind that we've talked about in my last lecture, which is actually, in some sense, participating in the very divine making of the incarnation, then we should expect not only that they write great stories which help individual readers at the moment of reading to body forth at last in their own minds states of mind and being that they had felt but never quite put into words. And, you know, the bliss of Lothlorien suddenly now it has a local habitation and a name, and you can go to Lothlorien any time you like, and you can reread that passage and be in that place. And it represents a real state of spiritual awareness, which is now clothed in trees and flowers and, you know, the sense of stepping across a barrier and a smudge. You know, they've created places and shapes and meanings which you can inhabit. And where they do that, that works really well. But if they are operating the imagination at the level that Coleridge is talking about here, and that Lewis was doing in that poem, then they should also be holding open for us a space that we haven't grown into yet. They should be holding for us. There should be, and I think there is, a prophetic element in their writing. And one of the things some years ago, I did a set of talks in Cambridge called the Inklings, Fantasists or Prophets, in which I said there's something very odd about the way, insofar as they're noticed at all by high-end literary criticism, they're always dismissed as nostalgic and backward-looking. They're always dismissed as, you know, a bunch of sort of frothy beer-drinking, pipe-smoking dons who wished it was still the Middle Ages, you know. And I'm sure they did wish it was still the Middle Ages in some respects. But when you look at how popular Tolkien is now, and, you know, what was done with the films, and we'll talk about this tomorrow when I talk about Tolkien, but, you know, about the way in which, well, just let me anticipate for a minute. Think about the conversation between Gandalf and Saruman about how they are to be wizards in Middle-earth. And Gandalf saying to Saruman, when Saruman says white will serve for a beginning, white can be broken into many colors, and, you know, I'm Saruman in many colors. And Gandalf says, he who breaks a thing to find out what it's made of has left the path of wisdom. And that, you say that to a kid who breaks their toy, you know, and, you know, ruins it. But the idea that we want to, our entire method of scientific analysis, which is always breaking down and reducing to atomizing into constituent parts, and then saying only the parts matter, there is no whole. That's been our entire approach, and we've left the path of wisdom. And then if you think about the kind of, as it were, the other opposition between the Saruman mind and Treebeard, and the way Saruman tries to destroy the forests and replace them with metals and wheels. And, you know, he has a mind of metal and wheels. And Treebeard's recognition of the fundamental unwisdom of what Saruman is doing, and the proper comeuppance, and the destruction of the forests leading to flood, and the release of flood. You think, well, maybe there's maybe this is holding open a shape we are actually moving into right now. You know, and that what happens at Isengard is in fact a prophetic look at what's happening to our world and what is going to happen to it because of the way we've done things. And then you think about the manufacture of the orcs, and, you know, there's all kinds of stuff going on there, which is prophetic. And I think there's stuff which is prophetic in Lewis. So I've brought in the name of Coleridge, and I'm already, you know, a long way back in what I wanted to say. So let me just briefly say, having said, therefore, that Lewis, in finding Christ, finds a reconciler between reason and imagination, and therefore his imagination is liberated. It no longer becomes a guilty pleasure. It actually becomes a working power of his soul, and he's got his goddesses together, and he's working with them. But I still would need to ask the question, what kind of thing does Lewis think the imagination is? Where is he getting his understanding of the imagination. And I would very much want to say that he's getting it ultimately, I think, from Coleridge. And the point about that is that Coleridge makes the case for the imagination as, first of all, as truth-bearing, as teaching us the truth of the world, as universally enfolded in everything else, everything that we do. Coleridge says that the imagination is the living power and prime agent of all perception. So even the most rationally worked, perceived scientific knowledge has already got an imaginative shaping in it. And he talks about the imagination as particularly awakening the mind's attention. So just so you know what Lewis thought about Coleridge, I've bunged into your things a passage from a very sharp verse epistle which he wrote to the poet Roy Campbell. Roy Campbell is a very good poet and a very fine translator of John of the Cross, but in my opinion, well, certainly was politically an odious man, and definitely on the wrong side in the Spanish Civil War. And Lewis was clear that he thought Campbell's politics were odious, but he also thought that Campbell was a great poet. And he got very annoyed with Campbell one day for writing a piece in which he used the word romantic as a term of abuse. And you can imagine that'd be a red rag to a bull for Lewis. So he wrote a verse letter rebuking Roy Campbell for using the word romantic as a term of abuse, and actually saying, you are, the very kind of poetry that you write depends on the romantic stream, and you should be defending the romantics against the reductionists and not selling the pass. And then he gives Roy Campbell a quick English literature supervision in iambic pentameter and rhyme. In fact, not pentameter, but a variety of line lengths. But anyway, so he's talking about the romantic stream. In England, the romantic stream flows not from waterish Rousseau, that's wonderful, but manly Scott, a right branch of the old European tree. It flows, I say, from Scott, from Coleridge too. A bore, a sponge, a laudanum addict. Oh, come on, give us a break. True. Yet, so he concedes everything you want to concede about the chaotic life of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. An archangel a little damaged, as Lamb said of him. Yet Newman, now Campbell is a Catholic, so Roy Campbell is a right-wing Roman Catholic. I mean, a really remarkable figure. I mean, a really good. Tolkien has a letter somewhere where Lewis and Tolkien and the other Inklings were all in the Eagle and Child, bird and babies they call it, all with their pints and smoking their pipes. And suddenly they realised this figure sitting in the corner with a broad-brimmed hat and a long pipe and a sharp eye and an eagle nose and the eye of a man who's had real adventures, which indeed he had, eyeing them and listening to their conversation clearly. And Tolkien says, it was so exactly like Strider at the Prancing Pony. You know, anyway, he's suddenly revealed to be Roy Campbell, the author of The Flaming Terrapin, and who deliberately sought the Inklings out because, you know, he loved their work. So there's plenty in common, but both Tolkien and Lewis thought his politics odious. Anyway, never mind. Here's Lewis giving him a lesson. So Newman, he appeals to Newman, Cardinal Newman, because he knows that Campbell's a Catholic and therefore it's a... Newman, in that ruinous master, saw one who restored our faculty for awe, who rediscovered the soul's depth and height, who, notice the allusion back, who will reconcile in me, but who rediscovered the soul's depth and height, and then the great line, who pricked with needles of eternal light, and England at that time half numbed to death with Paley's, Bentley's, Malthus, wintry breath. Actually, Malthus and Coleridge were at Jesus at the same time, interestingly. Anyway, so you can see, I mean, that's all true of what Coleridge did. It's a beautiful account of what Coleridge did. And you can see how Coleridge is therefore vital to Lewis about changing the way we see the world and the idea of pricking with needles of eternal light. In fact, you can, if you like, see in the pricking with needles of eternal light, and England at that time half numbed to death with Paley's, Bentley's, the wintry breath. You can actually almost see an anticipation in Narnia of all the people turned into statues by the White Witch, and Aslan breathing on them and reviving that which is numbed. So what did, I'm going to have to come to the end of what I say because we want a little bit of time for feedback too, but though we've got lots of time for that later in the evening as well, haven't we? When I was thinking these things through, I realized that turning back to the program, if you like, if you can call it a program, this is again written in retrospect, that Wordsworth and Coleridge had set themselves for that miraculous year of 1797 to 98, when they wrote the lyrical ballads together and published them anonymously. That actually the very thing that Coleridge in Biographia Literaria says they were after could be almost literally an exact account of what, between them, Lewis and Tolkien achieved, I think. So I've given you that as a quotation here. It's the bottom of the page. In this idea originated. So in this idea originated the plan of the lyrical ballads, in which it was agreed, this is Coleridge speaking, that my endeavours should be directed to persons and characters supernatural or at least romantic, yet so as to, this is the key, so as to transfer from our inward nature a human interest and a semblance of truth sufficient to procure for these shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment which constitutes poetic faith. One of the great phrases of literary criticism in its context. Mr. Wordsworth, on the other hand, was to propose to himself as his object to give the charm of novelty to things of every day, and to excite a feeling analogous to the supernatural. It's a very important phrase. To excite a feeling analogous to the supernatural by awakening the mind's attention. Absolutely the key phrase of the whole passage. Awakening the mind's attention from the lethargy of custom and directing it to the loveliness and wonders of the world before us. An inexhaustible treasure, but for which, in consequence of the film of familiarity and selfish solicitude, we have eyes yet see not, ears that hear not, and hearts that neither feel nor understand. Now, it seems to me that you could take most of the phrases in that passage, which comes from chapter 14 in the Biographia, so it's after he's had this great cosmic definition of imagination, after Coleridge himself has given a theological grounding to imagination and said that it is a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. So it doesn't get higher theology of imagination than that. He then says what they were trying to do. And I think you can see that both of these endeavours, as Coleridge called them, are at work in Lewis's best writing and in Tolkien's too. So certainly Lewis, since we're talking about him today, procures for his characters supernatural or least romantic just that transference and bodying forth of our inward nature that Coleridge was aiming for, whether it's the icy White Witch or the golden goodness of Aslan, whether the numinous Eldils of the Ransom trilogy or the beautifully embodied figures of Psyche and Orual until we have faces. But in some ways, actually, it's not the Coleridgean bit of that equation, as also the Wordsworthian, as Coleridge described it, what Mr. Wordsworth, on the other hand, that are there in Lewis. And of course, as you know, Lewis loved Wordsworth and read and reread the Prelude all the time. In some ways, I think it's the Wordsworthian rather than the more the Coleridgean side that makes Lewis an effective imaginative writer and apologist. So what's the Wordsworthian bit? It's to excite a feeling analogous to the supernatural by awakening the mind's attention and directing it to the loveliness and wonders of the world before us. So it's often been remarked that it's much easier to portray evil than to portray goodness. When Philip or even just sadness than happiness, and sorrow than joy. I mean, when Philip Larkin was asked why all his poetry was so bleak, which is perhaps an impertinent question, but he replied, "Happiness writes white," by which he meant you're writing with a white thing on a white paper. There's no contrast. There's, in other words, I'm not a good enough poet to be able to write about those things. But Lewis is the great exception in terms of whether you can describe goodness as well as evil. The sheer goodness of Lewis's good characters, the sense of the kind of solid joys and lasting treasure which he evokes in the weight of glory, and sustains so beautifully throughout the Great Divorce. The extraordinary skill with which he kind of gives to each of the Narnias their, what Michael Wood calls the capper element, the quiddity, the donegality of each book, and you just love it. And there's a passage somewhere in one of the books, I think it's in The Last Battle, where, Lucy's lamenting, that Narnia should come to an end, even though it's going to be renewed in the True Lands. Somebody says to him, you children says to her, you children come from your world into Narnia, where we're having a massive crisis. But we don't have massive crises most of the time. And you have to think of all the years of beauty and goodness piling up on one another, like just a rich kind of series of kind of beautiful springy mattresses of sheer, just accumulated, untroubled, solid goodness is going on. So I think Lewis is a particular gift for that. He also has this power which Coleridge speaks of, removing the film of familiarity, awakening the sense of wonder, awakening the mind's attention. It's something he strives for in his writing. I've given you a quotation here now from his great essay on 3 ways of writing for children, where he takes head on the accusation that the kind of books he and Tolkien write are escapist fantasy, or that they're compensatory fantasies, and they're not letting children deal with the grim realities of and he says actually there is such a thing as a dangerous escapist compensatory fantasy, but it's not the magical story about woods and lions and dragons. It's the supposedly realistic school story where you get to be, captaining the first 11 with no effort at all, and everybody adores you. They're stories of sort of, success and plaudits and power in this world, which is, there's a certain kind of school story like that, which then for adults, or so-called adults, becomes the sort of sex and shopping novel, doesn't it? And the point about that is, he says, the fulfillment this is Lewis now in the quote I've given, on the level of imagination, is in very truth compensatory. We run to it from the disappointments and humiliations of the real world. It sends us back to the real world undivinely discontented, for it is all flattery to the ego. Easy victories, cheap fantasies, we get it all and for nothing, and then we're all okay, and then we come back and we're still stuck at the bottom of the class, or not in the sports team, or dealing with an inadequate wage, or having trouble with people who bully us, or whatever is the thing we have to deal with. We're no better at dealing with it. We just had a bit of relief in pure ego-pleasing, fantastical flattery. And we come back to the world, and the world is worse for us than it was before. And then he contrasts that with the kind of thing that he and Tolkien are trying to write, and the description of Fairyland. And he says this is one of my favourite passages of Lewis. It would be much truer to say that Fairyland arouses, this is in the Reader, a longing for he knows not what. It stirs and troubles him to his lifelong enrichment, with a dim sense of something beyond his reach. And this is the key point. Far from dulling or emptying the actual world, it gives a new dimension of depth. He does not despise real woods because he has read of enchanted woods. The reading makes all woods a little enchanted. I think that's an absolute key to what's being achieved in Lewis and Tolkien, and indeed in MacDonald. Not only are we having apprehensions of things that we may yet realize in heaven given to us in an earthly form, but we're also sent back to the earth with some sense that the magic is still there, some sense of what the woods are, and we want to enter into that, and we're given new eyes. And I've quoted here the famous passage towards the end of the Dawn Treader, where they're saying, I don't want to leave, we shan't meet you there, how can I live never meeting you? You shall meet me, dear one, said Aslan. Are you there too, sir, I in our world? I am, said Aslan, but there I have another name. This was the very reason why you were brought to Narnia, that by knowing me here for a little, you would know me better there. And again, when Lucy has that lovely spell for the refreshment of the spirit, and it's a story she can never quite remember, and then Aslan says, I'll always be telling it to you. So the storytelling brings you into a realm of far deeper truth than you would ever otherwise have realized. I'm going to the claim I want to make, that on the one hand, there are supernatural characters in whom have been transferred that portion of our inward nature that we wouldn't otherwise get a handle on, and which procures for these shadows of imagination that on the one hand, and the other, that our attention is woken and a film of familiarity is removed and the world is re-enchanted. We could spend the rest of this weekend delightedly recalling to each other one part after another in the works of Lewis and Tolkien that do one or both of those things, and whose means of doing that is the aroused poetic imagination. And I think, as I say, that passage in Biographia Literaria, chapter 14, sets that out. I had the pleasure while I was at the Wade Centre, I guess it was last year, or was it? Yeah, it must have been last year. I went there with Michael Ward. And so they've got, most of Lewis's books. So I had the pleasure of reading through his copy of the Biographia Literaria, which is full of really interesting annotations and underlinings, and which he had all his life. I mean, he had it as a schoolboy. And it's in every man, it's kind of worn and falling to pieces. But, I just needed to satisfy myself that he was... Of course, he got a huge amount of Coleridge's thought, also through MacDonald and through Owen Barfield, as well as, directly from the source. So he was living and breathing this kind of stuff. So anyway, the reason why you've got an extra handout is I suddenly thought, and Mia kindly did for me, that it happens that in my book, The Singing Bowl, I have... two poems, one on Coleridge and one on Lewis, which, by making a careful fuss with the publisher, I made sure were actually on facing pages in the book so that they could speak to one another. And so this is a photocopy of those. And I think I might just conclude by reading those to you so that we can, as Seamus Heaney said of George Mackay Brown, when Heaney was reviewing Mackay Brown's wonderful book, An Orkney Tapestry. Heaney ends the review by saying of Mackay Brown, he says, he gives scholarship the kiss of life with a verse. And so I shall try and do that with these two poems. The only thing you need to know about the Coleridge poem before I read it is that Coleridge gradually began to realize he kind of was his own ancient mariner. And so much so that even in death, he did the thing of, it is an ancient mariner, he stoppeth one of three, and he's stopping people and pinning them to the wall. So he wrote his own epitaph, and the epitaph says, stop, Christian passerby, stop, child of God, beneath this stone a poet lies, or such as once seemed here, and he goes on, asking you to pray for him. So it's kind of like that. So I allude to that in this. Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Stop, Christian passerby, stop, child of God. You made your epitaph imperative and stopped this wedding guest. But I am glad to stop with you and start again to live from that pure source, the all-renewing stream whose living power is imagination, and know myself a child of the I am, open and loving to his whole creation. Your glittering eye taught mine to pierce the veil, to let his light transfigure all my seeing, to serve the shaping spirit whom I feel, and make with him the poem of my being. I follow where you sail towards our haven, your wide wake lit with glimmerings of heaven. So that's kind of Coleridge, and Coleridge as I think Lewis apprehended him too. And then this is my poem for Lewis, which I was happy to read on the occasion of that 50th anniversary. You know that when he was teaching Anglo-Saxon, I mean, obviously Tolkien was a professor of Anglo-Saxon, but all the Oxford dons, everybody had to do it. Somebody once described doing Beowulf at Oxford as like the huge skeleton of the dinosaur at the beginning of the Natural History Museum. You had to get past this vast pile of, the bones of language before you could proceed, to more familiar things. And for some people, it was just a terrible grind. And obviously, Lewis could have called his Anglo-Saxon classes, Anglo-Saxon 101 verbal shifts, but he actually called it Beer and Beowulf, which is obviously much better. So, from Beer and Beowulf to the seven heavens, whose music you conduct from sphere to sphere, you are our portal to those hidden havens whence we return to bless our being here. Scribe of the kingdom, keeper of the door which opens onto all we might have lost, ward of a word hoard in the deep heart's core, telling the tale of love from first to last. Generous, capacious, open, free. Your wardrobe mind has furnished us with worlds through which to travel, whence we learn to see along the beam and hear at last the heralds sounding their summons through the stars that sing, whose call at sunrise brings us to our King. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you so much, Malcolm. And as Malcolm mentioned some of his books of poetry, I should point out that downstairs you'll find scattered about several of Malcolm's books of poetry, so feel free to pick them up, reread some of the poems he's read, find some new ones. And that goes for any books, upstairs or downstairs. That's quite a random gathering on the shelf back there, but there are a few, there's some Muggeridge, there's a few Inklings related books on the back shelf back there. A true scattering, that is quite random, but downstairs, thanks to Bob Trexler, you've got every Coleridge you want to put your hands on a top shelf down in the library. Feel free to pull that off the shelf. Down by the piano is sort of the Inkling-ish shelf, which you'll find all your Inklings people, but you will also, if you do not know George Mackay Brown, which I'm going to assume that a bunch of you people do not. He's not as well known here in North America. Absolutely brilliant short story writer, poet, playwright, and novelist. And there's a bunch of his... George Mackay Brown.
He's an Orkney poet. He just spent his whole life in Orkney. He's he's the sort of the Wendell Berry of the Orkneys.
Or even in some ways almost a Flannery Connery of the Orkneys. So those things sort of combined almost. He is a man of place, a writer of place. But short stories, very short stories. So you could pick one up and read it in a few minutes down there. So nothing is off limits. The books are there to be read. So pull them off the shelf. Don't worry if you can't remember where they go back. We'll worry about that after the conference is over. But please do engage with the books that are there and the games that are around. Your schedules say we're back here at 7:30. We're actually back here at 7. Okay, at 7 o'clock we will be back here. That will give time for it to cool down because the temperature is going to drop a couple degrees in that time. We get to go downstairs into the old farmhouse where it is still cool thanks to those early Scots settlers and their stone houses. But that will give time for Malcolm to cover a few points that you feel like you wanted to get in maybe but didn't get in earlier today from either talk. So I'll give you a little bit of time to do that. And then for us to bring some of our questions to you.
Great, yeah.
Okay, and start picking your brain.